Have you ever just looked at a map of your own city and wondered, why is it laid out the way it is? In human geography, we learned that a map isn't just lines and names, it's a story. And today, we're going to unpack one of the most powerful stories written across the American landscape, the unique distribution of its ethnicities. Let's dive right in.
Seriously, think about it. Why are some neighborhoods mostly one ethnicity, while just a few blocks away it's completely different? Well, to understand the map of today, we have to trace the historical forces that drew those lines in the first place, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
Okay, let's start with this map. It shows the percentage of Black Americans by county. And boom, you immediately see that deep concentration in the Southeast. That is no accident. This one image is literally a record of history, telling a story of migration, segregation, and resilience. So let's break down the key chapters of that story.
Chapter 1 of this story, it doesn't even begin in America. It begins in Africa, with one of the largest and most brutal forced migrations in all of human history. This is the foundation, the starting point for everything else we're going to talk about.
The key term here, and it's a big one for AP Human Geo, is forced migration. See, this is the complete opposite of voluntary migration, where people choose to move for a better job or a new life. This was a violent system that tore people from their homes, and it's what planted the very first seeds of that concentrated pattern we saw on the map, right in the American South.
And the sheer scale of this is it's staggering. We're talking about 12.5 million people. A movement of this size didn't just tweak the map, it fundamentally reshaped the demographics, the economy, and the culture of the Americas. That cluster in the Southeast we keep pointing to? Yep, it starts right here.
But that initial concentration in the South, that was just the first chapter. The next huge demographic shift, something we call the Great Migration, actually happened within the United States itself. And this is where the map really starts to change.
So what we see here are two major waves of what's called interregional migration. That's migration between different regions of a country. The first big wave was after World War I, and the second came after World War II. Millions of Black Americans moved out of the rural South, pulled by the promise of industrial jobs and pushed by overwhelming racial discrimination.
So to really get this, you have to understand the push and pull factors. The main push factor was the decline of the incredibly exploitative sharecropper system, which pretty much trapped families in a cycle of debt. And the pull factor? Well, that was the promise of factory jobs in booming northern cities like Detroit, Chicago, and New York.
All right, so now let's zoom in from the national scale to the neighborhood scale. We're going to look at another type of migration, intra-regional migration, or movement within one region, and see how it created the segregated neighborhoods that, we still see in so many cities today.
This graph of Detroit's population tells a really dramatic story. Just look at those two lines. As the purple line, the Black population, goes way up, the blue line for the white population takes a nosedive. This pattern is exactly what geographers call white flight. And you have to understand, this didn't just happen randomly. It was actively engineered by some very specific and often illegal real estate practices. One of those practices was something called blockbusting. It was just as cynical as it sounds. Real estate agents would actually prey on the racial fears of white homeowners to get them to sell their houses cheap. Then they'd turn right around and sell those same houses at ridiculously high prices to Black families who had very few other options. It was a tactic that literally profited from prejudice, and it resegregated entire neighborhoods incredibly quickly.
And then there was redlining. Just imagine a bank taking a map of your city, drawing a red line around your entire neighborhood, and basically deciding that nobody inside that line could get a loan. That's what redlining was. It systematically locked whole communities out of homeownership, which is a huge way families build wealth, and it cemented residential segregation for generations.
Now, these discriminatory practices weren't just informal wink and a nod kind of things. Oh no, they were often backed up by the full power of the law. And to really understand the scale of legal segregation in the US, it's actually helpful to look at an even more extreme version, the system of apartheid in South Africa.
So, in the US, the policy was legally justified by the phrase separate but equal, which became the basis for Jim Crow laws. In South Africa, they just called it apartheid. The names were different, sure, but the goal was exactly the same: use the law to create and enforce a geography of racial separation.
This quote here is from the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. This single decision made Jim Crow laws the law of the land, especially in the South. It meant that states could legally mandate separate and almost always inferior facilities for Black and white Americans, everything from schools and hospitals to water fountains.
But the system of apartheid in South Africa, it took segregation to a whole other level. I mean, this wasn't just about separate facilities. This was about total geographic control. From the moment you were born, your race was legally classified, and that classification determined everything: where you could live, where you could work, even where you were allowed to travel. The government literally created separate homelands to try and enforce a complete separation of people on the map.
Now, these laws were eventually dismantled in both countries, of course, in the U.S. thanks to the Civil Rights Movement, and in South Africa with the end of apartheid and the election of Nelson Mandela. But their legacy, well, it's still imprinted on the landscape, and it continues to shape communities to this very day. See, this history isn't just in some dusty old textbook. It echoes in the present. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter are a direct response to the lingering effects of these geographic patterns. They're protesting the kind of systemic discrimination that is deeply rooted in this history of forced migration, redlining, and segregation.
And this shows us that the past is never really past, right? When we see debates today about renaming highways or military bases that honor Confederate leaders, what we're actually witnessing is a debate about geography. It's a real-time conversation about what history and whose history we choose to write on our shared American landscape.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? It's that the map is not a static object. It is a living document. The patterns we see on it today are the direct result of everything we've talked about: forced migration, huge economic shifts, discriminatory practices, and the ongoing struggle for equality. Which leaves us with a final question to really think about. When you look at your own community, how do these historical lines on the map continue to shape things like access to good schools, jobs, and justice today?